Thank you for being here tonight. I'm Shep Englander with the Jewish Federation, here with Brian Jaffe from the Jewish Foundation, and we really appreciate you being here for this historic evening. Tonight you will witness the official rollout of the 2019 Cincinnati Jewish Community Study. A community study like this is a mountain of meticulous work that takes well over a year, which is why it's been a decade since we've done one. And in the past decade, our world has changed quite a bit, and so has our community. And you'll get to see how tonight. But before we start to let you know what's in the study, I just want to recognize one person who you will not be hearing from tonight, and that's the Federation's longtime Director of Community Building, Barb Miller. Barb capped off a 20-year career at the Federation by playing a key role in the study that you will be hearing about this evening. When she retired last month, it was all completed and ready to be rolled out, and it would take much longer than we have tonight to even touch on the roles, talents, and accomplishments that Barb has contributed to our community and to many of the accomplishments you'll hear about tonight. Fortunately, all of that will be included in a special article in next week's Israelite, so read about it then.
Thanks, Shep. Well said. Good evening. I'm Brian Jaffe from the Jewish Foundation, and on behalf of Jewish Foundation President Brett Kohler, our trustees and professional staff, I'm thrilled to join you, Shep, the Federation leadership, and our entire community in celebrating this moment for all of the reasons that you articulated so well. I'd like to give you all a sense of what is in store for tonight's program. In just a minute, our colleague Kim Neustadt is going to come up and frame the presentation of our 2019 Cincinnati Jewish Community Study and introduce the research team from Brandeis, who will go through the high points of what's in that full report. Following that presentation, we will have time for Q&A, which will be moderated by me. And then Shep will be back up to offer some closing thoughts, including a brief description for how we intend to use the next year plus to engage in collaborative conversations with institutional leaders and with individuals in our community about the data that's in our 2019 community study. But first, it's my pleasure to welcome Kim Neustadt to the podium to kick off our program this evening. Kim is the Director of Research and Learning at the Jewish Foundation, and I just want to take a moment to thank her for her work on this project. It's been over the past year and a half, and Kim and our partners at Brandeis will describe the process of how a community study like this comes together. And there's no question that it's a team effort. It requires volunteer leaders and academic experts and professional advisors, but every team needs a captain. And in her first major project as a professional in this community, Kim has worked tirelessly, efficiently, and effectively to captain this project. So it's with great pride and appreciation that Shep and I ask Kim to come up and formally introduce the rest of the program.
Good evening. Thank you, Shep and Brian, for that warm welcome. My name is Kim Neustadt, and I am the Director of Research and Learning at the Jewish Foundation of Cincinnati. I've been the project lead for the 2019 Community Study, which has given me the unique opportunity to help shape this project. The study is a gift to the community, a living data set. The final report presents one subset of the data, a first look, but there is so much more for us to learn together over the course of the next year, which we are calling our Year of Learning. I'd like to start by acknowledging a group of people who have guided this process from beginning to end, the members of the Community Study Advisory Committee, whose names are listed behind me. This group of people have brought intention and expertise to this work. They elicited feedback about our community, about what people wanted to know, and they aspired to guide a process that was relevant and balanced diverse interests in our community. Committee members, please stand up so that we can honor your leadership tonight. I also want to thank the participating organizations and congregations. Without your help, the study would not have been possible. This has truly been a community-wide effort. As you listen tonight to the initial data presented by the Brandeis research team, let us know if something surprises you, interests you, or sounds confusing to you. After the presentation, Brian will moderate a Q&A. While we usually ask you to put away your cell phones for this kind of event, tonight we're asking you to pull them out and to submit comments and questions to jewishcincinnati.org/questions. The URL is also printed on your program. A few substantive questions will be highlighted and shared at the end of the evening. Index cards are also available on the refreshments table, and we will collect these at the end of the evening and respond to them in the coming weeks. Please just share your name and email address. Tonight, you will hear a lot of new information about our study. The study surfaces general, directional findings about our growth, where we live, and much more. But mostly, it will unearth more questions than answers. These will give us insight into directions to further investigate rather than specific strategies. As an example, at a first pass, how can we interpret what our geographic patterns mean for Jewish engagements? Looking at the data alone, we cannot do this with precision right now. But with more data to explore, with being able to look for context and to look for qualitative feedback from our community, we can approximate what's really happening in our community. Please try to withhold judgment. The best practice is to slow down and avoid jumping to too many conclusions. And furthermore, the study is not an evaluation of our agencies, congregations, and schools, but we do have an opportunity to look at the data and figure out together how we can use it to enhance our community in the decades to come. Our call to action is to bring a curious mindset to the coming months and year. Like any good scientists, we must observe our environments, come up with a hypothesis, begin to test it, and be willing to acknowledge that we may have asked the wrong question, and perhaps there are other questions to explore. And what if those questions are not in the best interests of any given organization? What then? We must balance how much we drive the data through our own agendas and predilections and how much we let the data drive us. Let us all commit to a year of learning to explore the data with open minds and be open to the possibility that it points to the need for change, that what our community needs may not yet exist. And now, I'd like to introduce our esteemed research team. Our advisory committee selected the Cohen Center for Modern Jewish Studies at Brandeis University as our research partner because of its cutting-edge methodology and commitment to providing actionable research for the Jewish community. Professor Len Sachs is a distinguished scholar of Jewish life and the director of the Cohen Center for Modern Jewish Studies. He also directs the Brandeis Hornstein Jewish Professional Leadership Program. Len is a social psychologist, and his present focus is on the issues relevant to the Jewish community. He heads a program that tracks the demography of American Jewry and has led a 20-year project to evaluate birthright Israel. Dr. Janet Aronson has been the lead researcher on the 2019 Cincinnati Jewish Community Study and has dedicated countless hours, enthusiasm, and creativity to making this project meaningful and relevant for Jewish Cincinnati. Janet is the Associate Director of the Cohen Center and has directed community studies in Boston, Washington, D.C., and Palm Beach County. Janet and Len, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and welcome.
privilege it is to be with you this evening. So many of you have come out. It's been a privilege to study the community. It's been wonderful to work with Kim, Brian, Shep, the advisory committee, and the numerous people who helped us carry out this study. For us, this is the fun moment. We get to share the results of more than a year's worth of work. I have a very specific task in front of me, and that's for the next probably 10 minutes to put the study in some context and to lay out some of the basic findings. I'm then going to turn it over to my colleague, Janet Aronson, who will talk with you about some of our more detailed analyses and some really interesting and we believe important conversations. As Kim said, we like to do actionable research. So I see this evening not as telling you what to do, but providing information that can actually be the beginning of a conversation and a more elaborate strategic planning process. So I'm going to start, and this is the context piece, by talking about, well, the entire United States. One of the things that we do is we track the size and the characteristics of the American Jewish population writ large. And we just released data a few months ago. We do this on a semi-annual basis, indicating that the American Jewish community now consists of 7.5 million individuals. And it's quite a substantial growth from the past estimates of the community. In 1990, we were only 5.5 million. When the Pew Research Center did their study in 2013, it was 6.8, 6.9 million. And it's quite interesting that for the first time in American history, the Jewish community is growing, and it is growing not solely because of immigration. Now, I come from, or I've been living for the last 40 years in Boston, Massachusetts. Our former congressman, the late Tip O'Neill, who was also the Speaker of the House of Representatives, had this very famous quote, all politics is local. So all politics is local, all understanding of Jews is local, and so what we want to do this evening is to talk about who are the Jews of Cincinnati, what is the Jewish community here, and what we're trying to do is to give you information to help you understand and plan better to serve their needs. I want to focus a little bit about using a community study and what we think we're doing. It is designed to describe, not to evaluate. It's designed to inform, not to prescribe what you should do. That's your job. You, with your leadership, lay and professional, have to figure out that. What we do when we do a community study, and it is akin to the census that the country, mandated by the Constitution, will do this coming spring, is that we paint a broad portrait of the community. What it does is it allows us to generalize, to see things in the community beyond what our own experience, the people that we know, the settings that we go to see. It's intended to serve as a baseline for planning your future, a benchmark against which you can measure progress, you can measure change. It provides information that can be used to prioritize and develop your strategic directions. As has been emphasized now a couple of times, tonight we're going to give you a summary. We're going to go through it quickly so we can hopefully have time for lots of questions and discussion. It's only the beginning of a process. And then I want to end with this. Some people believe that demography is destiny. I have a demographer. He's an older person who is a classically trained demographer, And he says, tell me how many Jewish babies were born in a particular year, and I'll tell you what the Jewish population is today. That's no longer the case. The Jewish population, how people identify, the ways in which they identify, the ways in which they engage, in some ways are up to us. It's up to you as a community to figure out how we create the settings that engage those folks. And so what we're trying to do with these data is to empower you, empower the community. How did we do this study? You don't want to go into the kitchen. You don't want to hear all of the details. It's a very complicated process. And actually, I should acknowledge that Janet and I are the figureheads. We do a lot of the work, but we're the figureheads for a much larger team of people back at Brandeis, and also the organization that actually did some of the calling. We developed a survey. It's based on questions that are used in other surveys. It was done in consultation with the advisory committee. We tried to use questions that had been used by other communities and by organizations like Pew, in part because you learn a lot sometimes by comparing yourself to other people. Our respondents for the survey were selected randomly from lists of dozens and dozens of organizations. We had over 2,000 households, Jewish households, that were interviewed. We had a nearly 30% response rate to the randomized portion of the sample, and the data were collected last winter and through May of 2019. People had the option of doing the survey online, but we also called people. Part of the analysis of this study, and this is what makes our approach a little bit different, is that we also use data from literally hundreds of studies that are done of Americans on a daily basis, and ask a question about religion and or ethnic identity. And we do that so that we understand whether the estimates that we're getting of the population are correct. We use it to adjust our estimates. There's some technical things like the fact that so many people today have cell phones, and if they weren't born in or when they became, at one point it was when they became a teenager, where were they living? Now I think it's where they start elementary school, where they were living when they got their first phone. So you need a national study to figure out how to contact people if you use the telephone. And then we also use benchmark data that we known things about the community, like how many people are members of synagogues, how many children are in particular schools, etc. There's a full report. There's a detailed methodological appendix. There are lots of tables and so on for especially the organizations in the community that want specific information. Those will all be made available, as will the data set. So the data is public. We strip it of any individually identifying information, but the data set is also available. We're going to talk a lot tonight about numbers. I hope there are no number phobic people in the audience. There are not too many of you, because we're going to talk about lots of numbers. But I want to make clear that when we present a number, because these are the results of surveys, that they are estimates. They're our best estimate. They have, for those who know a little bit about statistics, they have a confidence interval around them. And we tried to present only those numbers that we're pretty confident don't have such a wide confidence interval that they're not useful. We try to present comparisons only when we have sufficient number of people. What it means is that when we're talking about the whole population, when we're talking about large groups in the community, the numbers are very reliable. When we're talking about very small groups, when you're taking a little piece of the pie, they are less reliable. And we'll try to make it clear when we have such small numbers that the comparisons and the numbers really don't mean or you can't use them in the way that you can use other numbers. So enough with the background. Let me give you some of the key findings. And the question that everybody wants to know, or usually everybody wants to know, is how large are we? How many of us are there? And what you see here is that we're estimating the population of the community, the Jewish population of the community, at 32,000 individuals. It's 26,000 adults. And there are also, and you see it in this chart, a large number of non-Jewish individuals who are part of Jewish households. Now, we're using sociological definitions. They're not halakhic definitions. It's not hokashfut. It's not the law of return. We're using the definitions that have been used now by social scientists over the last several decades. In 2013, when Pew did its national study, one of the services that Pew did for us was to create a way of categorizing people that there was agreement about, at least amongst the social scientists and the advisors to the study, and I will plead guilty to being one of those people. And these are essentially, our definition is essentially people who say that they are Jewish, who consider themselves Jewish, either by religion or by culture. And I will summarize the detailed way in which this is figured out by saying that these are also people who have a good reason to say that they are Jewish. And the good reason to say that you are Jewish is you had Jewish parents, you had Jewish education, you are considered Jewish by a congregation, and it excludes people, Christians, who believe that they also have Jewish roots. We'll talk more about the details of this as we go through the presentation. Interestingly, while the Jewish population is 32,000, the total in Jewish households is closer to 50,000. I won't tell you what I think the implications of that are at this point, but it's one of the things that the community needs to talk about. It does represent an increase since 2008, your last study. But again, note that the increase in the Jewish population is smaller than the increase in the number of people in Jewish households. If this was a class, I would love to pause now for questions, because I'm sure there are lots of them, but let me just go on, because we may not finish if I don't do that. So just again, at the highest level, to give you some sense of what we did, we're able to identify essentially the geographic distribution of people. Obviously, that's important for decisions about where you place institutions, how difficult, easy it is for people to get to institutions. What's interesting to us is that the majority of the community lives in relatively close proximity in what we're labeling here the urban and central and east area. And so there is concentration of the community. What's also interesting is that the demographics, the characteristics of the different areas are different. This is something that I cannot imagine is a surprise to anybody. There are many more young adults in the urban center and many more children in the central and east area. What's also interesting about the community is the diversity of the kind of households. You know, in some communities, there's a stereotype. Some communities, they think of every Jewish household as either a household with two parents and two children, and or perhaps households with older adults. What this shows is that you've got a variety of households. You've got a variety of Jewish households in the community. And again, without going into my own drash on what are the implications of this, it's clear that there may be different needs for each of these different types of households, that this kind of diversity requires different kinds of responses on the part of the community. I'm going to end my piece of it by talking about intermarriage, because as you probably saw from the slide on the overall demographics, intermarriage is now a key feature of the community. 75% of the households include a couple, first of all, but 55% of married, partnered Jewish adults have a non-Jewish spouse. That means only 45 have a Jewish spouse. And this shouldn't be surprising. Data from national studies like Pew show similar levels of intermarriage. The Pew data are actually from 2013. Pew is being repeated next year, and my guess is that their findings for this entire region will look similar to the situation here. We have data, so I don't know why this is not appearing quite right. We've asked about the degree to which the community, the Cincinnati community, is supportive. And for me, the most interesting number here is 34%, that 34% have no opinion. And that's because 34% of them likely have very little interaction with the community. They don't know enough to know whether the community is supportive or not. We can talk later on about some of the details of this, and again, there are a host of implications. So I'm now going to turn the podium over to my colleague Janet, and she's going to present, we think it's a new and innovative way to organize the information about your community and to help you understand the patterns and the ways in which people engage in Jewish life in Cincinnati.
Okay, thank you. Okay. So before I get started, I wanted to point out that everyone has a little booklet like this on your seat. Some of the numbers that I'm going to talk about are in here, so if you can't see them on the screen, you could look here, as well as the map that you probably couldn't see that well. So there's some more details in here. And the full report is on the website. I think that you'll hear about that later. So what I'm giving you, in addition to what Len provided, what I'm giving you is just a taste of kind of from each topic that we studied, a few key findings. There's much more in the report. And as I go through this, you might be wanting to ask yourself, which of these numbers kind of, as Kim framed this, which of these numbers make sense to me, which are surprising, where do I want to know more? The answer, if your question is, can you tell me more about this? The answer will always be yes, take a look at the report. So we're just sort of picking through some things that I think will be of interest to a lot of people who are here today. The first thing I want to do before I get into the numbers is introduce a concept that's in this study. It's something we call the Index of Jewish Engagement. Now, I'm sure that most of the people in this room are familiar with the concept of Jewish denominations, mostly Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, and to a growing degree, none. And then there are other additional denominations, but those are kind of the major ones. And when people describe themselves using one of those labels, we have a sense of when it comes to Jewish life, what do they do? That a person who says they're Orthodox probably keeps kosher. A person who says that they're Conservative or Reform, less likely to keep kosher. Still might. What about the people who say they have no denomination? Is that less than reform? Is it nothing? Is it I don't like to use labels? That's a growing share of the population nationally, and it is a growing share in Cincinnati. The second problem with these labels is that, yes, it tells us something about how people engage in Jewish life, in sort of ritual life. But does it tell us anything about, are they members of the JCC? Do they read Jewish books? Do they, talk about Jewish topics with their friends? So there are all sorts of behaviors in Jewish life that are important to understanding Jewish engagement that are not captured by denomination. So partly for this reason, we developed another way of a typology of Jewish life, another way of characterizing Jewish behavior. This is not based on here's a set of labels and ask people which you are. This is kind of like, for those who are from this world, kind of like market segmentation. You look at what behaviors people do, and then you classify people based on those. And I'm going to present, I should say, this is developed for this community. This is a typology of what Jewish engagement looks like in Cincinnati when you take into account all of these different ranges of Jewish behaviors. We are not trying to evaluate Jewish behavior. We're not trying to say that one type is better than others. We're just trying to describe where it is that people are today. So this is our model, and you have this in your book. This is our model of Cincinnati's Jewish engagement. There are 5 groups. That's what we find in most communities. But in all the communities that we study, the composition, the characteristics of these groups vary. And as I said, this isn't we didn't predefine these labels and say who goes in which group. We said, what do people do here? And let's categorize them. So I'm going to go through each one of these groups in turn. But I want to sort of emphasize that the group names are designed to just sort of capture what's unique about these groups. These are groups that we develop with the names that we develop with the advisory committee. So they're just sort of suggestive, and I'll try to talk about what is unique about each group. And then as we're going through, when we get to the end, we might want to think about how would you use this information? If you know that 18% of Jewish adults in Cincinnati engage in Jewish life in a particular way, what does that mean? What more do you want to know? How would you design programs and activities that meet their needs? What are your goals for that group? So we'll go through them one by one kind of quickly and be thinking about as we go through. So the first group I'd like to introduce is what we call the personal Jews. This represents 18% of Jewish adults, so that's about 1 in 5. Why do we call them personal? Because most of the Jewish activities that they do are things they do on their own. They don't do them with organizations. They don't necessarily even do them with other people. Yes, they do donate to Jewish charities, but what are the things that they do? They eat Jewish foods. That's always popular with a lot of the groups. They do go online Jewish websites. They follow news about Israel very closely. They do Jewish cultural activities, which could mean read Jewish books, watch Jewish films. They talk to Jewish friends, but they are not, other than some donations, they are not really involved with organizations. The other thing that's on here, that you notice here, other than lighting Hanukkah candles, which a lot of them do, there's no ritual activities. They do not get involved in the ritual part of Jewish life. And as you can see from the bottom here, is this the laser? Yeah. So 71% of them have no denominations. Remember when I talked about this big group of people that have no denomination? A lot of them are in this group. The next group I want to talk to you about, this is a quarter of Cincinnati's Jews, are what we call the occasional Jews. Why do we call that? Because they do Jewish life occasionally and on occasions. The two occasions that we identified are Passover Seder and lighting Hanukkah candles. Now, if you'll notice, only 40% of them attend a Passover Seder. So this is not even all of them do it, but when they do Jewish things, these are the things that they do. Here you'll see again that 2/3 of them have no denomination. Many are Reform and then some other denomination. 23% are unmarried, which means 3/4 of them are intermarried. The next group is what we call the communal Jews. This is the smallest group, 10% of Jewish adults. What this group does is they do a lot of the personal things. They also do those occasional things. They do some ritual activities, but what distinguishes them from the other groups is this high level of involvement in community organizations. Almost all of them donate to Jewish organizations, and half of them volunteer for a Jewish organization. So this is what sets this group apart. And you can see here that we're starting to see a change in the denomination. Now almost half of this group is Reform, and some of them are conservative as well. This group, the congregational Jews, why do we call that? So it turns out that of this group, only 40% of them are synagogue members, but almost all of them attend services. They are involved more in Jewish ritual life compared to all the other groups. This is the group that we've seen so far. This is the highest involvement in Jewish ritual life. So that seems to be one of the ways that they express their Jewish identity. The last group here, which is 1/4 of Jewish adults, is what we call immersed. And as you can see, almost all of these rows are dark. Almost all of them do almost all of these things across our 4 dimensions, which is these holidays you celebrate at home, ritual practices, communal activities, and personal activities. So what's important to see here, I'm going to look at this denomination piece. Even though almost all Orthodox Jews fall into this category, only 17% of the people in this category are Orthodox. So I want to make it clear, this is not the same as Orthodox. This is people from all denominations, including a fair amount who have no denomination. So this is our picture of Jewish life. What do we do with this information? Okay, I think it's kind of interesting, but what do you do with it? So the first thing you might want to say is, okay, we know these people do different things, but what is that? How do we use that information? How do we act on that? So one thing that we can look at is, first of all, what's the difference in their demographics? And I've shown that on the bottom. I talked about some of the groups are more likely to have children, some don't have children, some are married, there are differences in terms of where they live and their ages, there are all sorts of things. But what I want to highlight is the differences in their attitudes about being Jewish. So it's not surprising that people who do different Jewish behaviors feel differently about being Jewish. But I think this is an important key to understanding how you would engage with people in these different groups. What are they looking for? It's not necessarily that people in one group we want to move to another group, but we want to understand the people in each group and see what they're looking for. So this is an example of one question which I think captures a lot without saying a certain type of Jewish life. It captures a lot of information about your sense of Jewish life. To what extent is Judaism part of your daily life? The top row here shows the percent, please, sorry, there's an error here. I say just ignore this minus sign. The top row here shows, of all people, all Jewish adults, how do people answer that question? It turns out that 28% of people say Judaism is very much part of my daily life. 18% of people say Judaism is not at all part of my daily life. But what's interesting here is to look at the differences between these groups. So remember that personal group that said that there's more personal activities, not organizational activities, not ritual activities. So in that group, about 3/4 say Judaism is at least somewhat part of my daily life. This occasional group, remember I said that they only do Judaism occasionally? So kind of by definition, it's not part of their daily life. So half of those people say Judaism is not part of my daily life. And then the numbers sort of go up from there. They're slightly different. So these are the sort of things we want to explore. Say, what are the differences between these groups? And if you want to increase Judaism, Jewish engagement for people in these groups, well, how you increase? So for people in this communal group, which is this one, almost all of them, even though they're not doing as many Jewish things as the immersed group, almost all of them feel Judaism as part of the daily life. So what does that look like? So that this is sort of to just get you thinking about how you would use this. Okay. I am going to go on to some additional findings. I'm just to sort of present some numbers from different topics of the study. This talks about children. This is obviously an important topic in the Jewish community. One thing that's really important is understanding the children in the Jewish community. We talked about the high rate of intermarriage. So 59% of all children are being raised by intermarried parents. 1/4 are being raised by 2 Jewish parents, and 16% are being raised by a single parent. So that's the composition of the community, and we have to think about what is the different experiences of those different children. Altogether, about a little more than half, about almost 60% of children are being raised Jewish in some way. The remainder are either being raised with no religion, or their parents have not yet decided what kind of religious upbringing they're going to have. There's only a small number, 8% of children, who are being raised entirely in a different religion. Of course, those are mostly children of intermarried parents. I want to talk about what do these children do. There are about 1,600 children enrolled in some type of formal Jewish education, which includes Jewish preschool, supplementary school, or day school, which is about 28% of Jewish children are enrolled in formal Jewish education. But remember, the Jewish children is only about 60% of all children, so none of the children who are not Jewish, even the parents who say, I'm thinking about it, or I'm not raising the Jews, none of those children are in Jewish education. So when you're thinking about all the children, it's of course a smaller share. It's only 15% of all children are in Jewish education. Similar pattern for informal education, which includes things like camp and youth group. About the same percent are enrolled are participating in some kind of informal Jewish education. One statistic that stands out that I know is important is that of the children in grades 11 to 12, 1/4 of them, Jewish children, 1/4 of them have gone on a trip to Israel. And that is clearly a high participation rate for that group. Synagogues. 28% of households are members of some synagogue. In our studies, we distinguish between what we call brick and mortar synagogues and everything else. Brick and mortar synagogue, we don't have a better name for this. If anyone can think of one, you can tell me afterwards. Brick and mortar synagogues are what we think of when we think of a synagogue: a building, a rabbi, probably dues of some sort, with some formal concept of membership. Everything else, it could be Chabad, it could be a Havurah, it could be like a high holiday service, it could be Hillel, something that you consider it your synagogue. So when you say, are you a member? You say, yes, it's this institution, but it's not one of these brick and mortar synagogues. So 28% of households are members of some kind of synagogue, 21% are dues-paying members of a brick and mortar synagogue. And one of the things that's interesting is we didn't just look at the percent, but we actually we reached out to all the synagogues and tried to get a number for how many synagogue members are there actually. And it turns out when you look at the numbers, there's almost no change since 2008. So in this study for 2019, there were 3,600 synagogue households total. In 2008, there were 3,500 synagogue households total. So it's essentially no change in synagogues. What has changed is because there are now more households, it's a decrease. It's a smaller percentage are synagogue members, but the actual numbers are pretty much unchanged. Another thing that's important is even though because there are different numbers of Jewish people in different households, about a third of Jewish adults live in a synagogue member household, but almost double that, 62%, attended a religious service, and 45% participated in some kind of synagogue program. So people are attending finding ways to attend religious services and going to programs at synagogues even without being members. I want to say a few points about Jewish communal life. We're at the JCC. 8% of households are members of the JCC. 28%, more than a quarter of Jewish adults participated in some program at the JCC last year. And the two other things we have in here are volunteering and charitable contributions. So 2/3 of Jewish adults donated to some charity, some Jewish, some non-Jewish. Volunteered, 82% donated to some organization. A few facts about Israel. As I mentioned before, about a quarter of 11th and 12th graders have gone on a teen trip to Israel. Half of Jewish adults have been to Israel. So that was teens, this is adult, which is higher than the national rate. Among our young adults, not the teens, but now the young adults, 72% have been to Israel. Many of them have gone on birthright, compared to 45% nationally. So the rate of going to Israel, the attachment to Israel, is really high compared to national averages. I'm going to move now into some social services issues. On the left is a chart about income and standard of living. Standard of living included here is self-described. This is how people assess themselves. Using this, less than 2% are poor or nearly poor. 11% are in a category that can be a little challenging to unpack. It's called just getting along. It is whatever they think it means. Often, these are relative terms, so it may be compared to my neighbors, I have less, so I'm going to say just getting along. Some people are going to say, I used to be worse off, and now I'm just getting along. So this is kind of, it's hard, and so it's worth further exploration, which I know is one of the goals of the community, to sort of understand what are the financial situations of people in these categories. But we do have some information about people's economic vulnerability. For example, 28% of households have insufficient savings to cover 3 months of expenses. If they lost their job, they wouldn't be able to cover their expenses for 3 months. 26% of households are not confident about paying for retirement. 18% of parents are not confident that they'll be able to pay for their children's college. And the last item here is that 5% of households said that finances made it difficult for them to participate in Jewish life the way they would like to. This topic is also about health and social services. 17% of households included somebody with some chronic health issue that limited their activities. 12% of households include someone who is providing care regularly. And 8% of households said that they were limited because of their health reasons in participating in Jewish life. I'm going to conclude with this slide, because one of the things we want to know, one of the goals of the study is to understand, are people satisfied with their level of engagement in Jewish life? And what might be, for those who are interested in engaging, what might be some of the barriers? What might be holding them back? And these are real opportunities for the community to think creatively. It turns out that 70% of Jewish adults feel at least a little connected to the local Jewish community, but only 15% feel very connected. So there's a lot of room in the middle. But this is really important. Almost half of Jewish adults said they would like to be more connected to the Jewish community. I think this is a great opportunity. This presents a great opportunity. So of those who said they wanted to be more connected, we asked them why, what are the barriers? What limits your connection? And this is a list of the most common responses, going from low to high. 12% said because they were concerned about safety or security issues. A quarter said that they felt that their political views made them unwelcome or uncomfortable. Almost half said, in some general way, that they feel unwelcome. 60% said that they didn't feel knowledgeable enough Jewishly. So I have, I'll give sort of an anecdote that I've given before, is that I don't think that this means I don't have, I'm not a rabbi. I think when people say this, what they generally mean is I don't have the basic knowledge and skills to be comfortable in a Jewish space. That if people say, shalom to me instead of hello, and I don't know what that means, that might be a signal that I don't belong there. So this is not really a test of the knowledge. This is how comfortable do you feel based on your knowledge. The last ones, I haven't found interesting activities, and I don't know many people. Now, I'll just say one more caveat about this, which I shared with some people this morning. Just because people say these are the reasons, it doesn't guarantee that if you overcome these, that all of a sudden people are going to start flocking out. I'm sure you all know, why aren't you coming? Well, I don't know anybody there. But all your friends are going, well, I still don't really want to go. I just was saying that. So we know, and so we know that these just sort of suggest some sort of patterns. And I would use that in general to think about the survey questions, and I'll kind of end on this point. If you sort of are saying, like, what were people thinking about when they answered this question? Why would people have said this? Think about it yourself. How would you answer this question? If someone answered a particular way, what might they have been thinking? So a survey is a blunt instrument. It just gets at some numbers. Behind that is all the individuals with their stories. I hope that this will be an opportunity to sort of think further, that it will generate a lot of questions. And then we dig deeper into the data. And then possibly the next step would be to find some of these people who feel this way and talk to them and figure out what they need, what they want, what would engage them. So that is all I have. And I think I'm now going to turn the floor over to Brian to take some questions.
Great. Thank you, Janet. Thank you, Len. We do have time for Q&A. People have clearly been using the website because we've got a bunch of questions that have already been passed in. I've got a handful right now. We'll start with something that Len promised, that if there are more questions about the composition of Jewish households, we can dig into that a bit more, sure enough. Can you explain why the total number of people in Jewish households has increased more than the number of Jewish people?
The answer. Am I on? Yes, because intermarriage has created households with large numbers of intermarried, of non-Jewish individuals. I have a simple math problem to put to you that will, I hope, explain what's happening. 100 Jewish individuals get married. The intermarriage rate is 50%. So half people marry another Jew, half the people marry a non-Jew. How many households contain a non-Jewish person? What percentage of households? I will make it a little bit more complicated. This will be an SAT question, not a junior high school question. What percentage of households contain a non-Jewish person? No. 25% is not the percent of households that include a non-Jewish person because, well, I won't say because why. Somebody else give me an answer. 50? No. Well, so yes, 50% of the households include a non-Jewish household, but because 50 Jews who in-marry other Jews, there are only 25 households there. So 2/3 of the households are intermarried households. And so this may not come out right, but solely from a demographic perspective, and we're talking about demography here, intermarriage essentially brings lots of people into the Jewish community, and so you have many more households. And as the rate of intermarriage, it's actually not changed a whole lot, it's stabilized a bit, but it produces many more households. Is that clear?
Can you just talk about producing more children as well?
Oh, and yes. and then the children. So and in fact, the children are really important because they're the opportunity. And here we are in Cincinnati, the home of Hebrew Union College. In 1978, the head of the Reform movement, Alexander Schindler, said, we've got to, he said, actually, I'm as concerned as anybody about intermarriage and how it is changing the face of American Jewry. But he said, listen, we can't continue to sit Shiva over intermarriage. We have to regard it as an opportunity to engage the children, reach out to the children of intermarried families and bring them closer, provide them with Jewish education, the opportunity to be part of the Jewish community. And so beginning in the early 80s, there was a shift. And what's interesting is that the opportunity is there, and I refuse to see it as anything other than an opportunity to take this wonderful tradition and to share it with other people. And to get back to the numbers, I'm a professor, so I spend too much time talking, but I'll do this quickly. But in terms of the numbers, once the majority of children of intermarried families are raised Jewish, are given Jewish education, become Jews when they come into adulthood, you're actually increasing the Jewish population. And nationally, that is exactly what's happened. Children born before 1980 in intermarried households had less than a 30% likelihood of identifying as Jewish when they became adults. After 1980, the number is over 60%. And so that's the opportunity. It's also the challenge for a community, but it's the basis of what we're talking about.
So speaking of children in Jewish education, from your read of the data, how can we better understand how enrollment in Jewish education for children has changed over time? How does Cincinnati compare to national data?
So I'm going to use this as an opportunity to talk about changes over time and particular comparisons to the 2008 study. Because of methodological differences between the 2008 study and this study, we limited the direct comparisons in the report to things that we were very confident were apples-to-apples comparisons. One of the ways we did it, and I gave it to you as an example earlier, is that instead of looking at the percentage of households that are synagogue members, we actually gathered the number of synagogue member households that are now and then, and we could compare them. So that is apples to apples. And we know that the synagogue, the number of synagogue households has slightly increased since 2008. We did something similar, and you find this in the report, we did something similar with school enrollment in preschool, supplementary school, and day school. And what we found was that enrollment in Jewish preschool has increased, enrollment in supplementary school has decreased, and enrollment in day school has increased. So you can find all the specifics of those numbers in the report. In terms of comparison to national average, I think I'm going to have to give you an IOU on that question.
Great. The question came in related to the index of Jewish engagement. Can you explain why it seems that involvement in social action is not considered Jewish engagement? Must all Jewish engagement have some ethnic or religious marker?
That's a great question. The items, if you look in your booklet that has the full list of behaviors that went into this index, what you'll see is that they focus more on types of behaviors than specific areas of behavior. So for example, we included participated in a program, volunteered, donated to Jewish organizations. But we didn't say, was your volunteering, helping out at a food pantry or social justice or political action. So it's just some sort of volunteering for or with a Jewish organization. So to the extent that social justice might fall into that behavior, as an example of that behavior, what then we can do, and you'll see this throughout the study, we have our 5 categories. And then we look consistently as so we don't use social justice, let's say, to create the categories. But we look at it as a way to kind of examine the community and say, okay, the people in this group tend to do these kinds of activities, and the people in this group tend to do these kinds of activities. So essentially, we are really focusing on the behavior. We're not focusing on people's attitudes. Do I think social justice is important? We use their behavior to create the groups, and then we say, of the people in this group, how many people think social justice is important? And then it's really interesting because you can see, and I gave you one example of an attitude, but you can see where are there similarities behind the groups. No matter what group you're in, everybody agrees that this is an important part of being Jewish. And then you can use that as a lens to say, what kinds of things could we do to engage the entire Jewish community? One of the good ones usually is Jewish food. Doesn't matter how you're engaged, you eat Jewish food. But other things, let's say something that's specifically about ritual practice, that is not going to engage everybody. I mean, you saw there are some groups that almost everybody has a Passover Seder. Some groups, it's a small minority. But, and I think this is, I'm going to take the time to say this because I think this is a great illustration of how I would use this information. If you know that there's a group where the one Jewish thing they do a year is have a Passover Seder. They're not involved in organizations. They're not members of synagogues. But they are doing something at home that they call a Passover Seder. So you might think to yourself, what might I do to that to engage that group? Should I say, you should come and join a synagogue? I think that's a big, I saw some, no, that was the right answer, no. That's a big step, but might you be able to do something with them and say, you are already doing a Seder at home. You are not involved in organizations. Here are some resources that you might use to make your Passover Seder that you're already doing somewhat more meaningful. And how do you find them? So I think that that's a way to say, so it's not just a question of what % of people across the board do a Passover Seder, but what percentage of people for whom the Passover Seder is the one and only Jewish thing they do a year? And that's really different than the people who they do that sort of part and parcel of their Jewish life. So I don't know if that answered that, but
that's great. No, and on a related note, but a little more broadly about the index of Jewish engagement, how did you find the 5 index categories that you discerned in Cincinnati? How do they compare to what you found in other communities, particularly in the Midwest?
So it's really hard to compare because we use the same basic behaviors, but the patterns are really different. One thing that's interesting is how much of the Jewish behavior depends upon the context, which is what do other people in the community do? What opportunities are there? So if a community like Pittsburgh, where we did a study and we did this model, which has a really dense Jewish central core with all the Jewish life and people of all different ages and Jewish behaviors sort of live in the Squirrel Hill area. That means that the people who live in that area are exposed to just a lot of opportunities. So it may be the people who are sort of less involved but live in Squirrel Hill do more Jewish things, not because they're seeking them out, but because they're easily available. In Palm Beach and like the heavily Jewish areas, everybody eats Jewish food. I mean, that's the easiest thing in the world. And in some other cities, that's, going to find Jewish food, that's a big commitment. So I think that's why the context is important. But in general, the patterns are we tend to have, in every community, we have a group that is immersed. We've had that all along. We came up with that name. People who pretty much do everything. In some communities, it's a small part. In some communities, it's a bigger part. We have a group that is sort of a low engagement group. In this community, I probably would call it the occasional group, but you could argue because people do different things. Then there tend to be sort of 3 groups in the middle. And you could really think about, well, it's really different kinds of Jewish engagement. And this is one of the things that we've learned. It's not where we would want to say, well, these people are more engaged or less engaged. We're just saying they are differently engaged. And that's pretty much consistent across all the studies we've done. And I think that that's one of the most important takeaways from this model is to move away from this sort of high to low spectrum and just to think about different ways of engaging. And the other thing is to move away from another term. I talked about denomination, but to move away from another term that I'm trying to move away from, the term affiliated. Affiliated sometimes just means synagogue member. Sometimes it means synagogue or JCC member. Sometimes it means synagogue member or donor to federation. That really varies, but there's like a sort of small set of things which sort of gets you to be called affiliated, and then there's everybody else. So the problem with that is that it's a binary. It's a yes, no, you either are or you aren't, and it doesn't really capture all the other ways of connecting with Jewish life that are not those. And of course, it has an implication of affiliated good, unaffiliated bad. So this gives us some new language to think about that, and this has been, I think, one of the most powerful ways that this has been used in other communities.
Can I just add a comment to that? It's a very interesting question. Janet emphasized the diversity, and we showed it in the data. You have very different households, you have very different ways of being Jewish. But some of the patterns and some of the underlying issues are very similar. The proportions are different, but the issues are the same. So you've got people who basically are happy to be Jewish. Everybody is proud to be Jewish, but they don't like Jewish organizations, or they don't want to be part of Jewish organizations. And my concept of Judaism is that Judaism is a team sport. So it's a little bit hard to be a Jew and not to be interested in organizations, but that comes out of a lot of the data. And one of the opportunities, you could call it a challenge, is how to engage people in doing communal activities. And I think it's particularly challenging right now, on the one hand, but also there's lots of opportunity because of the internet, because of social media, because of Zoom and Blue Jeans and all of the other kinds of programs. You don't have to, if a child is going to celebrate bar mitzvah, you no longer have to be a member of a congregation to do that. You can have a tutor based in Yerushalayim, and the child can work with them online. Doesn't have to be part of a community. And so I think that's one of the things that dimension from personal to immersed. What's also clear is that one can be culturally involved Jewishly. One can know Hebrew, one can know Yiddish, one can pay attention to Jewish books and culture. I think one of the most extraordinary things that's happened is the development of Jewish film and Israeli film and how popular and important they've become. And that's a very different way of engaging than in the synagogue. And I hope what the study does is it helps you see those kinds of patterns here in Cincinnati and then begin a conversation with one another about how to respond.
Great, thanks. I'm going to pass along two more questions, the second of which is going to go to Shep to address in the closing remarks. And I'm just going to foreshadow for a second Shep's closing by renewing the promise that on the landing page of the Year of Learning website, there's going to be a link for you to submit questions. It's going to stay live for a long time. So, we chose to do Q&A this way tonight just to be efficient with our time. But if you've got a question that wasn't answered tonight that you want to submit, please feel free, and we promise that we'll get back to you with an answer. So, Len, in your opening presentation, you described how Brandeis defined who's Jewish. And notwithstanding that excellent explanation, there were some questions that came in just wanting to understand a little bit more.
Sure.
What's the criteria? How did you decide who's included? When we did the phone surveys, the internet surveys, how did you decide who's excluded? What's the criteria for what's Jewish?
Well, because it was a survey and it was what we call a closed-ended survey, there were a bunch of questions that were asked. It was probably a dozen different questions that were asked of people. The first question was, what, if any, is your religion? And if you said your religion was Judaism, and then we asked you some other questions about your upbringing and your parents and so on, and that seemed consistent with how we typically define what it is to be Jewish. They were counted as Jewish. People were then asked, other than religion, do you consider yourself to be Jewish? And if people said yes, they were asked again these set of questions about their upbringing and so on. Brian said how did Brandeis define it? We didn't either look to Louis Brandeis or to our own research team to define it. Basically, what we've done is taken what is now accepted, and we want to do that by other social researchers, and again, Pew kind of codified it for us, a set of rules. Assuming that people tell the truth, and we have lots of reason to believe that people told us the truth, or if you ask detailed and specific enough questions, it becomes harder to not tell the truth than to tell the truth. We're pretty confident that this is giving us a sense of the Jewish population. We don't consider people who say, well, I'm married to a Jewish person and I light Shabbat candles, or I'm taking my children to Hebrew school. If that person also hasn't said that they converted to Judaism, then they're not considered. Those are people, Jewish affiliates. There are also people who say, but it's very few people. I have another religion. We don't consider those. They may have had Jewish background, but those are people of Jewish background, not Jewish individuals.
Can I just throw in a summary? Because I just so people remember it. They have to say that they are Jewish, either by religion or culturally. They have to have at least one Jewish parent, or be raised Jewish, or converted. That's like the sort of short answer. And the only exception to that are people who are in the category of Messianic Jews. So there are some people who sort of meet all of those. They have Jewish parents and they say they're Jewish, but then it turns out that they're Messianic Jews. And so the social science definition has excluded those people from being counted as Jews. But that's kind of the simple answer to remember.
Great. Okay, so I just want to thank Len and Janet one more time. For everything, your expertise, your insights, and your expert facilitation. The last question really brings us back to first principles here. What is the value of a community study? And that just seemed like a perfect setup for Shep to take us home and explain what comes next for us this year.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Janet and Len. And thank you, every one of you, for coming tonight. It says so much about our community that we had a packed house and we had people standing in the back. We originally planned to have round tables, but too many of you RSVP'd. So what is the value of a community study? And obviously, Janet and Len could give a more in-depth answer, but I only have 2 minutes. That's why he gave it to me. And part of the answer is what just happened tonight. You're thinking differently about what our community looks like, who counts, how to describe categories than you did when you walked in here 75 minutes ago, right? That's the value, to open our minds, to get us to think differently, because as we learned tonight, 50% of the people in our community are not connected and want to be more connected. So that's our challenge. What is it that we have to do differently to help people that want to be more connected to connect? And Janet and Len gave us a bunch of breadcrumbs, and we have to follow the trail. And tonight was not intended to be at all the end of the conversation. It's supposed to be the beginning of the conversation. And so we need to think about what are the topics we want to dig down deeper on. We need to hear from you. What do you want to learn more about? And we will have specialized, focused conversations on those issues. I'll give you an example. One of the big anxieties that we had before we did the 2008 study was people were afraid that our young adults were all moving to New York and Chicago and the coasts and not coming back. And what we found in the 2008 study was that our young adult population was about the same as other Midwestern communities, and we kind of breathed a sigh of relief. But tonight we found out that it's not just that we're doing okay, or we're actually doing much better than we thought. 53% of Cincinnati Jews are under 49, and our population of 35 to 49-year-olds, which was actually 10 years ago, 10 years younger, which was a weak area, it was actually below the national average, is now 50% above the Midwestern average. So it really shows that what's going on in this city, in this community, is something that's attractive to young adults, but a lot of those young adults are living here but not yet connected. Similarly, we found that 33% of our households are now in the urban area, which, by the way, doesn't include Amberley or Gulf Manor, but is south and around the city and including northern Kentucky. We haven't done a lot of programs or outreach there. We've done some. Mayerson Foundation's Access program did a bunch, but there's more that we can do and that we can learn from. And then finally, we have this tool, this index of Jewish engagement, which gives us a completely different lens to think about who we are and what people are looking for. And all of that will come together, not only on the questions page, which Brian mentioned, but in the Year of Learning, which Kim mentioned. The Year of Learning is going to be our opportunity to really dig deep, get more specific. Tonight's presentation was a little bit like the desserts on the table there. Little sampling, lots of different flavors, but very small bites. So come back for bigger meals and bring your appetites because there's so much more to learn. Thank you for being with us tonight, and take care.